Hi, and good evening, everyone. My name is Lisa Sawsville, and I'm the Executive Director of Vermont Coverts, and we're so glad you've joined us for tonight's winter reading webinar. Tonight, we'll hear from conservation leaders sharing their favorite books that inspire a deeper connection to nature and conservation. Before we dive in, I'd like to share some exciting news. A generous donor has pledged up to $5,000 to match new and lapsed donor contributions 2-to-1. So your gift can triple its impact. So if you want to learn more about Vermont Coverts and contribute to our organization, you can visit the website at www.vtcoverts.org. So thank you for being here and for supporting Vermont's wildlife and forests. Vermont Coverts is all about building community, so please type where you're from in the chat box. And you can also put in the chat any of your favorite titles if we don't cover them tonight. Tonight, we're hosting Tom Rogers, Executive Director of the Stowe Land Trust, Roz Renfrew, Wildlife Biologist with the Vermont Department of Fish and Wildlife, and Ali Kosiba, UVM Extension Forester. We'll go through the group at least twice, hearing about their favorite picks. And we're going to start off with Tom.
All right. Good evening, everybody. Am I unmuted yet?
You're unmuted. You're all good.
All right, great. Well, thanks everybody for coming tonight. I wasn't sure who was going to be the first, and I was hoping it wasn't me. So I'm the sacrificial lamb, I guess. And yeah, there were a few books that popped to mind for me with this, and there were kind of two seminal ones that I don't really want to talk about, but I want to at least just put out there that I think everybody in the conservation field should read, which is Silent Spring by Rachel Carson and Sound County Almanac by Aldo Leopold. To me, those are kind of the absolute foundational books that, I think everyone in society should really read, but especially people in conservation. The one that I did want to talk about is a book that really had just a tremendous impact on me as a young person, which is Walden by Henry David Thoreau. It was a book that I read, I think when I was 15 or 16 years old. And it was interesting because so many books you kind of read end to end, and there's kind of a narrative arc to them from one place to another. And to me, Walden has always felt almost more like one of the great sacred texts, like the Bible or the Quran or something like that, where yes, you can read it from one end to the other, but it's really all about like individual passages and what they mean and what the impact of that is. And I remember being, a teenager, being up in my bedroom at night and just poring over the pages of that book and reading passages of it and reading them back and pausing and thinking about it. And it was, I think, one of the first times where I really kind of rethought almost like what I wanted to do with my life and how I wanted to live and who I wanted to be. It was just so foundational that way. And I'm sure this will be a book that someone will talk about tonight, but the other book, before I pass it off, that I think is very similar to that in tone, that feels like one of these great sacred texts, is Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. It just kind of has that tone of, you can read it end to end, or you can just take a passage out of it, or you can take a quote out of it. And so one of the things that I wanted to share before I kind of pass the book on to the next person is that I actually have something, probably one of the most important things I have in my life is this little leather-bound book that includes a lot of poems and passages and quotes and things that are really important to me that I've been keeping for decades. And on one of these pages are some of my favorite quotes from Walden, from Henry David Thoreau. And there's one that has always really struck me, which is this phrase, "In wildness is the preservation of the world." And it's something that I think often gets misquoted. Oftentimes people say "in wilderness," but I think there's a really distinct difference between those two. I love that phrase, "in wildness," because wilderness is something that's kind of big and out there, and you need these like big wide open spaces to call it wilderness. But I think wildness can be absolutely anywhere. So to me, that idea of wildness that Thoreau is talking about is like the flock of geese flying over Central Park, in Manhattan. I mean, it can just exist everywhere on the face of this planet. And so that's just one of the things about it that's really struck me. And happy to pass on the next book recommendation.
before you guys go, Tom, have you heard of Walden warming?
I have not.
Oh, are you going to talk about that one, Allie?
Well, I had a lot of books to talk about. I just pulled it off my bookshelf right here as Tom was talking about it. And so I was going to mention it because it's awesome. And I do know the authors, the scientists that have researched the information that went in there. Do you want me to talk
No,
about it
I'd
now?
love to learn more about it. I mean,
All right. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
go
this
ahead. Tell about it.
is Dr. Richard Premack and his graduate students. They actually used historical records, some from Thoreau, about plant locations. So, you know, observations of plants, but also so many other naturalists that just recorded observations. And they went back to those locations as best as they could find them and did surveys and basically found out, you know, there's substantial change in what species were you know, distributed, and seeing that habitat ranges of species have shifted, often in the southern edge of the range have shifted northward since Thoreau's time. So it's a really interesting book, especially if you like Walden. It really touches like on that historical data and like that time since he wrote that book, and also just the importance of, you know, anybody recording observations is so important. And really, we like one thing that we helps us understand change is having long-term monitoring data. And so it's really interesting that they, you know, found like anybody could record observations, plants, and it really helps with the scientific information, our understanding of change. So, you know, putting a plug in for like everyone, the community science, making observations. So I recommend this book. He was a speaker at the Forest Ecosystem Monitoring Cooperative meeting a number of years ago and came and got to meet him in person.
Well, as long as you're going, Allie, why don't you share one of your books and then we'll move on to Roz when you're
Okay.
done.
Yeah, and so coming into this, I was thinking, I know you've been doing this for a number or, you know, some amount of time, Lisa, so you probably covered a lot of the books. I don't actually know what books have been covered, but I was trying to think of some other books that maybe haven't been covered. But one book that this really was one of the impetuses for me to study forest ecology in grad school, is this book, Hidden Forest. And it's called The Biography of an Ecosystem. It really gets into research, but I think it's like a very captivating and easy to read book. But I say that as a scientist, so I take that as a grain of salt. I like the nerdy and the minutia, but some really interesting findings. This is mostly out in the Pacific Northwest where this is set. You know, things about like scientists looked into how there could be a lack of nitrogen in these old growth forests, and they found there was a symbiotic bacteria in the needles of conifers that were taking atmospheric nitrogen and providing that to the trees. You know, this like beautiful ecosystem service that no one had known existed before. So this is an awesome book, The Hidden Forest. By Loma. I actually don't know how to pronounce his last name, but really great book. That's from a while ago. Yeah, I have lots of books. I have an entire bookshelf that's just forestry and ecology books. So I have probably more than can be talked about tonight.
No, that's great. You know, and what we found, so Coverts has a book group and we read books throughout the year. And what we do is we take those kinds of books and we read them over 4 months. So we do half the book and we discuss it in 2 months, and then we do the other half of the book and discuss it 2 months later, so that it's digestible. Because like you said, some of these, even though you're nerdy, you know, you want to kind of really think about it. You may have to go back and read about it or take some notes. And so, and it might be a little exhausting, and so you don't want to read it at night, you know, and so we take that long look at it. So it's really fun to get those titles that you as a biologist really kind of, you know, love. So thank you for sharing that. That's awesome. Roz, you're up.
Okay. Well, I'm going back to foundational sort of material for me. Kind of like what Tom was talking about. I'm not going quite as far back as him, but I thought of a couple books right off the bat that were very foundational to me in my career, and also in connecting me to nature in a way that that resonated with me because it was connecting birds, which I loved and specialized in, to being a woman, to being a researcher. And so that's the second book. The first book I'll talk about is by E.O. Wilson, who, if I'm sure everyone on this on this call knows who E.O. Wilson is. And he was sort of a founding father of a biodiversity, right? He didn't coin the term, but he popularized it back in the 80s and early 90s. And really, he was the reason I read his book. I read this foundational book called The Biodiversity of Life. I'm sure a lot of you, let's see, can you see that? I'm sure a lot of you have seen this. And I read it after college, after undergrad at UVM, and was doing field work jobs and piecing those together, but not finding like a full-time, career kind of job and wondering what to do next. And I read this book and I right away applied to grad school after reading this book, because I realized that I wanted to be involved with conservation biology. And that was kind of a new term at the time. This is, early 90s. And it was really sort of when conservation biology as a field was just starting to be developed. And this book, I think, was one of the reasons that field came about. And what it does is it takes you through the science having to do with biodiversity. It takes you through evolution and adaptive radiation and what is a niche, but it does it through all these examples and stories from around the world. And then he goes into, talking about just ecological concepts like the roles of species in communities and keystone species, all these sort of ecological theory concepts, but he does it in such an interesting and compelling way with a lot of cool examples all throughout. So it's kind of a geek book, but it's done in a way that that I think anybody can enjoy and understand and take in. And then he gets into the loss of biodiversity, and he talks about the sixth extinction, which people didn't talk a lot. Like now you hear it all the time, but people didn't really talk about it back then. Like he was sort of one of the first people to sort of speak out about what was happening with biodiversity. And he gets into concepts like conservation biology and what can we do about it? What do we need to do about it? And it was really this alarm call, early alarm call, before a lot of other people started chiming in about that. So to me, it was very influential. And I really loved that he was an entomologist and originally was going to be a birder, but he lost hearing, or he didn't have hearing in one of his ears. And so he ended up studying ants all his life. And if you read any of his books about ants, it's fascinating stuff about their social systems. Really complex, really cool stuff. So I'd recommend anything he's written on ants as well.
Roz, does he mention in that, I remember an interview where he said that it's his poor eyesight that
oh yes, I'm sorry. It's eyesight, not ears. Yes,
yeah.
You're right. Yeah. Oh, and I got to meet him once, and I brought my book. So the signature is there, and he draws a little ant. Isn't that cool?
So I guess that one isn't one that gets lent out.
I did lend it out a couple of times, but usually I believe that books are meant to be shared. And if I give it away, I don't track it, which is why I don't have the second book I'll talk about tonight. But this one I don't do that with. You're right.
I read that when I was in grad school as well, and it was a fascinating book. He was a fascinating man. He really was. And what I love about so many of these books, so you go back, so Sand County Almanac was published in, I think it was 1946, 1947, after Leopold died. And, his land ethic, when you read it, carries through to today, right? Mm-hmm. And the things that E.O. Wilson wrote about carries through to today. The things that Rachel Carson wrote about carries through to today. That's fascinating to me about science and these books and what we continue to learn about our natural world. You know, sometimes it's a reframing, but often it's a nuanced understanding. And I just think each of these books adds to that collection. I don't know what else to call it. So I love hearing about all these books. All right.
And Rob, the only reason I brought up the eyesight thing, and I apologize, I must have just been kind of deep in thought about what you'd been saying, and I missed that you said hearing, but he the reason that stuck out to me so much is that there was some good friends of ours from my wife's growing up that were born with a child who was born with some physical disabilities. And one of the things that we did is we wrote them a letter kind of talking about people who have had physical disabilities and who have not used them, or not actually just overcome them, but actually use them kind of as their superpower, that it basically defined like how they were able to contribute to the world so greatly. And E.O. Wilson was one of those people that I remember hearing that if he had been able to see better, that he wouldn't have spent so much time like crawling around on the ground looking for ants, because that was the only distance that he could see. And as a result of that association, like he gained that really strong connection to the natural world. And I just find that so like lovely. I mean, there are so many examples of that, like E.O. Wilson, of people who have kind of used something that was different about them as their actual superpower and why they were able to contribute so much.
I love
That's so
that.
true, Tom.
That's really cool. I hadn't really thought about it, but I love that. I like calling it your superpower. I gotta
Mhm.
find mine. All right, Tom, how about another book?
Oh, you all just, I just lost everybody for a sec. What'd you say, Lisa?
I said, how about another book?
Yeah, so another one that I wanted to talk about is I figured I would go with one that was influential to me a long time ago, and then one that I literally I'm actually only most of the way through, but have read a lot of other writings of this author, and it's a woman named Hannah Ritchie, and this book is called Not the End of the World. And it's absolutely fascinating because so much of, I think reading about conservation and the planet and sustainability tends to be relatively, I don't want to say pessimistic, but at least let's not call it optimistic, right? Like a lot of the trends that you hear about most often are not necessarily going in the right direction around biodiversity and climate. And one of the things that I really like about this book is that she is really quick to point out the things that are going well around kind of the global human footprint on the planet and the areas that we really need to work on. And so I think because of this sense of optimism that you get from this book, it feels really empowering. And so there's like a few things that she'll talk about, like the fact that her great-grandmother's carbon footprint, or her grandparents' carbon footprint, was actually about twice as high as hers is today. And the fact that a lot of like a per capita carbon footprint of all of us is actually in the downward trend, that agricultural land use across the planet has actually peaked and is starting to go downward. And so a lot of these things that are the trends that are going in the right direction. And to me, she talks about the reasons why, which is so important as somebody, as we all are in the business of quote unquote, like saving the earth, right? And it's because people cared to address these problems, cared to address these issues, and did things about them and devoted their lives and devoted their careers to addressing some of these issues around biodiversity and climate. And it just shows that it's really starting to work, that we're seeing some really positive trends and seeing things in the right direction. And she's really quick to point out some of the things that are not going well, but that, and why we need to continue focusing on those. One of the ones that she brings up actually is the kind of juxtaposition of cattle, and how that's really something that we haven't solved that much, that cows really are still having a pretty major impact on biodiversity and climate. But that so many of the other things are really moving in the right direction. And she points out that people often tend to think that the idea is that there's like conservation and sustainability on one hand, and people's standard of living and quality of life on the other. And she points out that actually it's usually the opposite, that more and more as people's quality of life and standard of living goes up, oftentimes they're carbon footprint and their impact on biodiversity tends to decrease, tends to diminish, and provides a lot of statistics to back that up. So really just absolutely fascinating book. She did an amazing interview recently with Ezra Klein from the New York Times, which I listened to twice in a row. I was painting my house this summer, which is what inspired me to read the book. So highly recommend anything by Hannah Ritchie.
Very cool. I'm not familiar with her at all, so that's on my list now.
Yeah.
I have been putting in the chat links to the books on Amazon. I am not encouraging you necessarily to buy on Amazon. You are certainly encouraged to go to your local independent bookstore, but I am putting so you have the titles and information if you want to learn more about the books. That's in the chat, just so you know. All right, Allie, you're up with book 2.
Okay. So I also wanted to do a book that's a little bit newer. So this is published in 2020. So this is called Forests Adrift by Charlie Canham. He's a professor, actually, maybe he's retired now, at the Carey Institute of Ecosystem Studies, which is in New York, like in the Catskills kind of area. And I do know Charlie, he's an amazing forest ecologist and researcher. And one thing that this book is about our region. So it's specifically about the forests in New England, New York, Northeast United States. So it really covers many things that, a lot of folks here know about, but sort of the history of our land use, historical agriculture and high grading that happened in our forests and grazing of animals, and then some of the more current threats that forests face, like invasive insects and plant species, heavy deer browse. So this is just a really great, very scientifically accurate, but I think it was fairly easy to read. Again, it's hard for me to know what is hopefully folks find that same thing to be true, that it's backed by research. He has citations, but he puts them in the back of the book, not embedded in the text, so it's not super dense in that way, but really great that he covers a lot of the really amazing research, decades and decades of scientific research that we have in our forests, that together we can kind of put together the story and understanding of how our forests work, how they interact, how they respond to different stressors. Really amazing. So I really like this book. It does leave, I will say, as far as being optimistic, it sort of leaves you at the end like, we don't know what's going to happen. It's very realistic. It's laying out the current status and condition of our forests and sort of the threats that forests face with a lot of the new stressors that we have, climate change and all sorts of impacts like that. So it does leave you a little hanging at the end, like what's, in the future. But at least it, provides the basis for where we are now. So I do recommend this book.
That's great. Thanks. Roz, you got another one for us?
I do. Okay, so this is a really, again, I'm going back in time and I don't even have the book. This is one of the books I lent out and it never came back, and I haven't gotten a new one, and I really feel like I should reread this book. But this is a book by an author named Terry Tempest Williams. Okay, we got some nods. And it's called Refuge. It was published maybe in 91 or something, like ages ago. But again, foundational for me in my young years, figuring out, what inspired me and learning about new things. And it was the first book I read really that, you have Rachel Carson, right? Here's someone who's an inspiring female in the field. And I think I was really looking for like women ecologists or biologists that inspired me. And she had a ecology background. I forget her exact degrees, but and she worked at a national park for a while, and she ended up teaching. And so she had this ecology background, but she also wrote books that were very much about her life, life experiences, and weaving that together with nature, with observations of nature, with experiences in nature, phenomenon in nature. And so it was a really great synthesis of sort of a woman's point of view, not so much in terms of her career, but in terms of life experience, and then relating that to things happening in the natural world around her locally. So she grew up in Salt Lake City, and she grew up near a refuge called Bear Lake Refuge. And this book relates what's going on in that refuge in one year where the water levels are actually rising. There was a huge amount of flooding one year. And so she's talking about the destruction to the ecology of the lake caused by flooding. And she's also weaving her observations, especially of birds, which is what drew me to it. It had a peregrine falcon on the cover. So I was doing peregrine work at the time. So I was like, ooh, I have to read this, and had no idea what I was in for. And she talks about the women in her family. A lot of them, her mother and her grandmother included, died of cancer, breast cancer, presumably from the Nevada nuclear test site. And she talks a lot about her feelings around all of that, but also weaving it into the experience of watching the lake rise and watching the loss of wildlife as a result of that rise. So thinking about this book again now, just in preparation for tonight, made me really thoughtful about going back to see what she's written lately. She has another book out. It's probably been out for like a dozen years at this point, but it's called When Women Were Birds. And so that has women and birds in it. So that's really intriguing to me. So I have to read that one. I think it might be more poetic than Refuge. She also writes poems a lot. And so she has a lot of writings that are sort of right between, prose and poetry, or, somewhere between those two things, which can make it interesting. But it just makes me thoughtful about the fact that now Salt Lake is actually drying out and the levels are low. And I just wonder, I don't know if she still lives there and what she's been writing lately, but it just it's such a juxtaposition with, what her experience was decades ago in this book, Refuge, compared to what she's probably writing about now or thinking about now. So I'm hoping she's written about that as well. Anyway, it's very inspiring. It was very helpful to me as a young scientist to see somebody making it very personal, and talking about her personal experiences, because I always found refuge in nature myself. It's a spiritual thing for me, and she writes very spiritually.
Roz, have you read the book she wrote about national parks, The Hour of Land?
I have not read that yet.
Okay.
Did you read it?
Yeah. That I was trying to remember which of her books that I read, and I just looked it up, and that was the one. But yeah, beautiful writing.
Yeah, really interesting writing. Her style, yeah.
It's funny. It made me think not of a writer, but of a time in my life. I had little kids and I hadn't been reading for a while, and I couldn't discuss books with people. And I was camping, and there's this kid it was when Harry Potter first came out, right? They were reading the first, and this like 8-year-old's like, look, I'm on page 203. I mean, they were so excited, and it was really cool. And I'm like, I can't discuss books with anybody. And the first book I took out was Ken Kaufman, Kingbird Highway, because it had something about birding in it. It was sort of the same thing, Roz. And it was a great book to read. It was just so fun because it was a little bit about birding, but it was also about his adventure and his connection and all those kinds of things. And so it's like reading Soul of an Octopus. I know you read Soul of an Octopus. That's another one that there's a woman who was sort of a scientist, and they did stuff with octopus, and it was even at Middlebury College, some of it. So it was really cool. There's so many books, too many books. Tom, what's up next?
Gosh, I just took a very quick about face because you mentioned a book of fiction that was one that you really enjoyed. And I guess I came into this thinking strictly about nonfiction, but there was one that I absolutely adored. by a woman named Vandera. I've read 2 of her books now, but the one called Where the Forest Meets the Stars. And it's actually, gosh, yeah, so I'm just looking it up to get it so I can get it right. It's about a woman who is doing graduate research on nesting birds in rural Illinois. And she basically befriends this young girl who kind of wanders into her life, who has like a mysterious past. And there, it's one of these books where, like these ones where people kind of fall into each other's lives at the right time and become like kind of a makeshift family, just at a point where everybody's feeling really alone. But I love kind of that idea of using like nature and talking kind of like what Roz was talking about, like kind of that relating to somebody who is doing field research, and that like amazing descriptive prose of like the sun setting over the prairie as she's going out doing this bird research. It's just an absolutely beautiful book. And there's this mystery all the way through it, because this young girl comes into their life and claims that she's actually from the stars, and that she's not from this planet, and that no one's out kind of looking for her because of that. And all the way through, it's kind of one of these, is this like a magical realism book? Or is this just a girl who's lonely and lost and that's kind of come into these people's lives? But anyway, it just popped into my mind just now based on you talking about that, Lisa, because um, it was just so beautifully written, and it has so much of that kind of like emphasis around nature and birds, and those beautiful descriptions of like the landscape and the work that she's doing. And I think all of us who are in this field, Roz and Ali and Lisa and all of us would really kind of relate to that, and kind of see ourselves in that position. And especially at that point in your life where you're kind of young, and like relationships are coming in and out, and you really need that kind of grounding and foundation of the people who are going to kind of be there and be your team.
That sounds great. That sounds good to me, because sometimes I just need that. I like that it connects, biologically, but also has that extra little piece so that I can read it and sort of get myself lost in it. Because sometimes, like, Ali said, I don't know how too nerdy this is or how hard it would be to digest. And sometimes those books, as fabulous as they are hard to digest,
Yeah.
and you just don't want to sit and read them, but you kind of want to be brought along a story about those kinds of things. So it's kind of nice. So that's a great book.
And Glendy Vandera herself, I think, is also like a PhD scientist as well, and kind of pivoted into writing novels partway through her career. So it blends it well.
Neat. Thank you. Ali, what you got next?
Oh boy, I have like a lot of books sitting in front of me, and I was debating. But
What's next?
one book that I don't actually have in front of me that I did want to mention, that something Roz mentioned sparked it, thinking about like female perspective in ecology, is there's a great book. It is a novel. It's called Letters from Yellowstone, and it's about a female botanist in Yellowstone who works in Yellowstone, like, oh gosh, over 100 years, like when Yellowstone was like being established. It's by Diane Smith. It's just it's a really nice book. And I remember reading it maybe in like college or in my early 20s, and just was very inspired by it. She goes off into the wilderness and collects plants, and has to ride horseback and things like that. So I did want to mention that book. But I guess the book I'll mention, because you can see that I have a lot of tabs here, is a book that I love. It's called The Tree. And so this will probably be no surprise to anybody why I love this book, because I adore trees, by Colin Tudge. But the byline is A Natural History of What Trees Are, How They Live, and Why They Matter. This is a dense book. It's not a book you're going to sit down and probably read in, one fell swoop, but it's just really, amazing. I mean, one thing I love, he starts off with what is a tree? And it's something that when I have done teaching at UVM, I always talk about that, like, what is a tree? And, usually people are like, oh, I know what a tree is. No, do you know what a tree is? We actually don't have a universal definition of what a tree is. And so it's a really just like very interesting, captivating book. If you love trees, it gets into a lot of different trees and species, and you can kind of pop around in it. It's one of those books if you wanted to read different parts of talk about different species of trees or types of trees. You can, and you'll see. Yeah, like I said, I have lots of bookmarks and tabs in it. It's like a book I reference a lot.
Show the cover again.
It's called The Tree.
And who's it
Oh,
by?
sorry, it's with my thing. It's hard to. How do I get that in? Oh, maybe if I hold it against myself. There we go. That's better.
By Colin Fudge. Fudge?
Tudge.
Oh.
Tudge. Yeah.
Okay.
It's wonderful.
All right. Roz, you got another one or no?
I have a partially another one. I didn't put any thought into this. It's just sitting here. But it's another book for bird nerds. And this one is by Bridget Stutchbury, who is a bird researcher in Canada. Let's see if I can. It's called Silence of the Songbirds. Wait, there, can you see it? So it's sort of like the bird version. She makes me think of the bird version of the Rachel Carson book. You know, it's talking all about songbirds and their ecology and how they migrate and, you know, all these cool things about birds. And it's somewhat geeked out. I mean, it talks about the research. It talks about it though in a storytelling-ish kind of way. So it's not dense or hard to get through, but it is somewhat technical. It does talk about birds and their ecology. And it talks about her experiences researching birds really all around the hemisphere. And then it talks about why some birds are declining and what is it we can do about it? What are the reasons? All of that kind of thing. So you can kind of get a sense, you know, it's generating appreciation and knowledge about the birds and then talking about what the threats are to the populations and what it is we can do about it, not just in the big picture, but, you know, you and I every day sort of things we can do about it. And I thought it was really, I think it fills a really important niche in that, you know, Bridget was one of the first ornithologists to start putting geolocators on birds, which tracked where they go. And now it's like everyone in the world does it all year long, all over the place. It's a very, you know, she was like one of the first, I think she had the first paper or second paper out of research that was based on geolocator data. And so she really had a certain knack with it and a certain way of storytelling about it. And it's, I think, an important story that brings people along. There's so much interest in birds now. It's one of the fastest growing hobbies, or has been anyway. I'm not up on like the latest stats there, but it's a way to bring people into the bigger picture of, you know, birds are more than just what's at your feeder. These birds are traveling all over the world. They're encountering all these different habitats and all these different problems and threats. And so I think it's a great way to sort of bring people into the bigger picture of what birds need, which of course translates to what a lot of other wildlife and plants and trees need. So yeah, I think I think it's a must read if you're into birds at all, or if you're into looking at wildlife from the bigger picture, wildlife that move around the globe.
Did you see the Bullock's Oriole?
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just asking if she's the Bullock's Oriole that was here in Vermont. Did you know about that?
I did not, but I'm you know, I'm paying attention to all kinds of, I'm not just about birds anymore. So now I'm like not as honed in as I once was, and I don't hear about these things all the time.
I just saw it on the birding thing. So I haven't seen it either, but I saw pictures that people have posted. They're pretty cool.
Cool.
Exciting.
Where was it?
I don't remember. Someone's yard. They actually invited people in their house so that they could watch it, so they wouldn't be
Nice.
cold. Yeah, it was a very nice community that was being built around this this little bird.
cool.
Tom, you had a
happens often.
question?
No, I was just gonna ask Roz, like, Silence of the Birds. I'm just curious, like, I feel like for me, it's not a coincidence that I'm reading something right now or just about to finish this book, Not the End of the World, that's kind of like, here are the trends, here's what's going right, here's like this uplifting message, like here's what we can build upon, like, and like Silence of the Birds almost kind of it's just very much in its title, you're just like, oh man, like is this gonna be like another one talking about how like trends are not looking good? I mean, is there any kind of an uplifting note or a positive trend or like here are the things that are going well that we need to build on kind of?
Yeah, I think the positive end was just that we can do things about it.
Yeah.
And talking about, it, and they're not all tanking, right? It's not
Right.
all bad. It's just talking about the problems that are out there. And it's very hopeful in terms of like, there's absolutely things we can do, like everyday things, things that aren't complicated, that we can do. So I guess it's hopeful in that way. Yeah.
That's great.
All right, Tom. Is this round
Is-
3 or round 4? I guess that would be round 4.
I think we're past round.
I know, I get so excited. Well, I'll share a couple.
Yeah, please, Lisa.
Well, it's just new ones that are out. So Vermont Almanac the new almanac has come out. These are written about Vermont by Vermonters. There's actually one in this issue about a coverage cooperator, Bill Pendergraft, came to his land, and sort of he wrote about how his neighbors connected him to the outdoors. So this is out and available now in your local bookstores, and that is, I actually haven't done much reading in it, but what's nice, it is like an almanac, right? In terms of, you just have to pick it up. You can read a page and a half article and put it down and come back to it. So it's a great one by the fire or by the, wherever you do your reading, to pick up a little snippet, a little information. So that's a fun book.
Can I add something to that one, Lisa?
Yeah.
So just a little plug. So 2 or 3 of the little vignettes in there are about work that that biologists in the program that I manage are from. So a discovered plant and a couple other stories. So we have like biologists from Fish and Wildlife in there and actual real work that they do featured in there. And they're beautiful photos, beautiful layout in that book. It's really nicely done.
Yeah, definitely encourage people to get a copy of that for sure. That's a great one. Let me ask, I saw Allie answered Tim. It looks like he looked like children's books. Does anybody have, children's books that you would recommend? I mean, in college, and it's still my favorite book, Dr. Seuss's The Lorax. The Lorax is my absolute favorite children's book for thinking about the environment. And so that would be the one I would read. Not the movie. Don't do the movie. The movie isn't very good, but the book is pretty great. Anybody else have a favorite children's book or, anything they want to cheer along there?
I was going to say The Lorax.
Yeah, that's the one that really pops to mind to me. Oh, The Wind in the Willows. I was saying,
That's a
Rachel
good one.
Cohen. Yeah. My daughters just are growing out of that age. We're reading the Harry Potter books now, so a little bit more advanced. But when we were at the Lorax age, which was not too long ago, 2-3 years ago, I would read that one to them so frequently, and it was almost impossible to get through it without getting choked up. Every single time you get towards the end, it was, just puts a huge lump in your throat.
I'll also plug Anne of Green Gables series. I think that was pivotal for me as a child, like why she was always running off in the woods and in nature, and that I loved Anne of Green Gables. I still want to go to Prince Edward Island only because of Anne of Green Gables.
Me
My
too.
parents promised me as a child, it never happened.
Totally agree, Ellie.
One thing I was also gonna say is I also love like picture books of trees and nature. Is like a nice way if you have folks that like maybe don't want to pick up a book on trees that I that I provided before. Like I have a lot of coffee table books. And this is a really cool one. This is gonna be hard to see. It's like these composite photos of really big trees. It's also called Tree, which is confusing because my other book was, but it's a new vision of the American forest. And it's these like these composite photos, so of like sequoias, of redwoods, like you know, American Sycamore, and there is an Eastern White Pine by, folks might know Bob Leverett, who is a forest ecologist in Massachusetts. So his Eastern White Pine is featured here, and it's a very much like a old field weevilled white pine with multiple stems, but it's huge because they had to take so many photos to capture the size of this tree. So it's a cool book because it has some text, but it's very photo heavy. So for folks that, you know, don't want to read as much.
That's really great. So for all of you out there that are listening, if you have favorite books, you know, put them in the chat as well. I think those are really good. You know, it's other kids' books, Stella Luna, you know, anything that had animals always intrigued me and my kids. There's one, and I can't remember, but it was like wild and crazy facts about wildlife. And like my son's favorite fact was that turkey vultures poop on their legs to cool themselves. And that was his favorite fact. But there are a lot of little facts like that about it that were in the book. So, and we often found books that if you go to like the library or the stores at like the Audubon Center or the Birds of Vermont Museum has a wonderful gift shop with a lot of different books along with children's books, those kinds of things. And so if you ever go to the Montshire Museum or you go to the Echo, those bookshops often have some wonderful children's books on the natural world and natural resources. So we're getting a few in there. Pilgrim at Tinker Creek by Annie Dillard. Someone had mentioned that in a previous winter reading one. That's a great one. A Girl of the Limberlost, Ant Hill by E.O. Wilson. So these are some other books that people are suggesting. So really, really love Winter World by Bernhard. That is absolutely one of my favorites.
Yeah, I love Winter World. I love Bernhard.
Yep.
Oh, Mary Holland
Curious.
naturally. Oh,
Go ahead.
Somebody mentioned Mary Holland's Naturally Curious. That was another one I was thinking about
Me
talking
too.
about.
Yeah.
Good one.
Yeah, and you can subscribe to her weekly Naturally Curious email updates, and you get a little blurb, which is really fun.
Didn't know that.
Yeah, and her day by day one is fun too. So she has that Naturally Curious and the Naturally Curious day by day, and it's a great way to learn about the various, you know, what's going on and what to look for when you're out walking. You know, if you don't have an idea, you're like, oh, this should be happening. Let me keep my eyes open for this. So, you know, and you know, my advice to everybody is just get out and walk every season, every day. Get out, like, you know, E.O. Wilson, crawling on the ground, seeing what's down there. That's really fun as well. You know, but of course, you know, curling up by the fire with a good book. That's why we host this in the winter, because this is the time to pick those books. You know, Christmas is coming, Hanukkah is coming, Kwanzaa is coming, all of these things where gifts are given and exchanged. And so if you're a book person, perhaps some of these titles will work for you. But anybody have any other books they'd like to share? Something we missed, something you're reading, something that's on your to-be read list?
I love all the ones that are coming in here.
I know, isn't that fun?
Yeah.
Lisa, do you compile these and send them around, or?
I will, when I send out the recording to the group to let them know the recording is available. I will put a list with it that are in here. It'll take me a little while, so because you're all typing a lot of them. But it is quite fun. With the Coverts book group, so Coverts has a book group. We meet every other month and we discuss a number of books. Our books for next year, I'll share with all of you, is wait, I gotta go look them up. Is Coyote America by Dan Flores, Under a White Sky by Elizabeth Colbert, and Hurricane Lizards and Plastic Squids by Thor Hansen. So those are the ones that we've selected for the year. We usually read half the book and then we discuss it, and then we read the other half over 4 months. So we're not delving too hard into any one topic. So too fast. It makes for some fun discussions. And but the list is long. Go ahead, Roz.
Oh, I'm just wondering if you can give any heads up about what that last one is about. The title is very interesting.
I'd have to go read the synopsis again. I usually put
Yeah.
together about 10 books and we do a survey and let them kind of rank what they want to read. And this one is the one that came out third, and I can't remember the synopsis for that particular book. I'll let you know when I read it though, or I'll find it and look it up. We have a list, like I said, like I can't get through the whole list, and now I'm going to add your books to this list, and it's going to get even longer. There are so many great books out there to discuss. So like Crossings was an amazing book. We have such an impact on the environment by creating and driving on our roads. One of the biggest things you can do is, not drive the speed limit instead of speeding. That's huge. And they talk about the cars being a moving fence, right? You think about it, it's just this moving fence and they can't time it. And I love the other thing that really was fun about the book is you are not in traffic, you are traffic. So, there's a lot of concepts and things that we can read. Like I love Tom's idea, and I think I have a similar type of book of writing down quotes, that I find that are really important. And like, Allie said, she has all these tabs and markers in her book. I do the same thing. So I encourage all of you to do that as well if you don't already. It's a great way to really digest some of the things in these books and to remember them. So that's another tip or trick that I might share, or that our Tom shared, that I'd like to share as well.
Yeah, I think if our house was on fire, Lisa, after made sure everyone was safe, this would be definitely the first thing that I would grab before I ran out. It's pretty important, and it's all of those things that you've connected to over so long, and going through it and reading it again, it just is kind of astounding, because it was something that 25-year-old Tom connected to, and 31-year-old Tom, and like all those different parts of your life, and you're like, oh yeah, I remember reading that back in college, or yeah. So I highly recommend this.
Thanks so much. Well, we're rounding on 8, and I think we've discussed all our books. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask? You can either type it in the chat, or you're welcome to unmute yourself if you like. All right. Well, I'm not really hearing much, so I'm going to wish everybody a happy holiday. For those that you came on a little bit late, I do want to reiterate that Coverts has a match going on. We have a generous donor that's offered $5,000 to new or returning donors from 2 years out. So if you haven't given, or you're new to Coverts, please visit our website and consider making a gift, because it's 3 times what you give. Would count, because it's 2 to 1. So that's really exciting. Regardless, we love having you on these webinars and hope that you'll join us again in the new year. This is the end of our programming for 2024, but we're so looking forward to what we're designing for 2025. Some exciting things. So be sure to sign up for our e-news. Our e-news does go out once a week on Fridays with all the different programs by Coverts and other conservation organizations, so that you may be able to find a program that's near you, because it's so much easier to go when they're near you. And of course, when they're online, we love having you on as well. So we wish everybody a happy holiday season, safe driving on the roads. Hopefully we won't have a lot of flooding as that snow melts. And I look forward to doing this again with you all next year.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Lisa. Thanks, Roz. Thanks, Allie.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Happy New
Bye-bye.
Year.
Thanks, Lisa.